Welcome back to Telltale. I'm Greg,
I'm Emily.
and we're here to give you a discussion of a favorite topic and kind of following up on our last topic video where we discussed classic science fiction and specifically the golden age of science fiction and how that was focused on how science affects people's lives or how people can use science to affect their lives. This time we're covering space opera. Now, space opera can fit into that classic kind of narrow definition I had of science fiction, but it can also stand completely outside that and be really just fantasy. I mean, your basic space opera is kind of like Battlestar Galactica was described as wagon train in space.
Yeah.
It
Space westerns almost.
You could take the stars and planets and aliens and spaceship and trade them for a desert and horses and 6-shooters and covered wagons and have the same story effectively with most space opera. Space opera can kind of go into science fiction. I was kind of thinking about that. Star Wars is a really good example of what people say it's not science fiction, it's science fantasy. But the definition I came up with for science fiction, for true science fiction, where some kind of scientific development affects people's lives, that's the Death Star.
Yeah.
In Star Wars, you have this Death Star being created for the first time ever. It's a brand new invention. It's a scientific weapon that can destroy whole worlds, and nobody had this before, and it affects everyone in the society and really affects the rebels so that they sneak in and steal plans to figure out how to stop this weapon. So it is, under my strict definition of science fiction, it is science fiction.
And later, if you know the rest of the universe of Star Wars, you can go into the Sun Crushers and all those other developments that developed off of the Death Star.
Yeah.
So.
Though you could argue when you get to The Empire Strikes Back, there isn't really any new scientific development.
Not by that
that
point,
one.
no.
It's just Darth Vader kind of chasing them around.
Yeah.
So that one is more traditional space opera, where you could take all the science out of it, all the space out of it, and still have the same story.
Yeah.
It also kind of creates an interesting twist where some things that you wouldn't consider science fiction suddenly become science fiction under my strict definition. Historical novels.
Oh, yeah.
Trying to think of the specific example that I had in mind the other day. Air warfare in World War I was a scientific technological invention that significantly affected how warfare was done and really increased the numbers of people who died with aerial bombing and stuff.
Yeah. The Enigma machine in World War II.
Exactly. Submarines are a technological invention that really changed things. The atomic bomb, and that's all history. That's all real history. And yet a story about those things would fit into my definition of science fiction because it's science
historical
affecting people's
fiction.
lives.
Yes. Interesting.
So it's interesting how those definitions I'm setting
the lines
up are
get blurred a little bit.
are getting blurred between lines, but I still believe in that. I still believe that what you should call science fiction is something that does take a scientific technological situation and examine how it affects people or society. So a lot of space opera, like I say, you could turn it into a Western, you got the same story.
Yes.
You know, literally Battlestar Galactica was described before it was aired as
Firefly.
Wagon Train in Space, and that's even why they hired Lorne Greene to be Commander Adama in that show, is because he was on Wagon Train.
Yeah, I think of Firefly, which was set up just like a Western. In fact, it was made to be very Western-esque, very intentionally.
So there's a lot of those space opera stories. You could substitute a Western setting. You could substitute a medieval England setting. You could substitute
Samurai-based Japan.
samurai-based Japan, World War II, Civil War, American Revolution, running out Roman
Roman
campaigns.
Empire. Yeah.
You could substitute any point in history as the background, as the setting of the story, and still have the same story playing out.
Interesting.
Usually, space opera is focused on the hero's journey, which, of course, if you read Joseph Campbell, goes all the way back into mythology, all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
You have the hero's journey as the main theme that runs through it. So a lot of mythological stories, a lot of your old epic poems all fit into this kind of trope that has become space opera in our day today.
Interesting.
And of course, once again, Star Wars consciously borrowed from Joseph Campbell and the Hero of a Thousand Faces with the hero's journey. That's what Luke Skywalker is all about. So, how did it become space opera? That's the part I wanted to really get into a little bit. I haven't read a lot of current space opera like Alistair Reynolds or what are the others that are writing today? Children of Time, Adrian Tchaikovsky. I haven't read those people yet. I got to get to them one of these times.
Our to-be read list will outlive us, just so you guys know.
Well, that's why I have somebody young.
I gotta find a new partner eventually. Someone much younger than me to carry on the legacy of my to-be read list. Yes. Telltale will never die.
Nope.
We'll keep finding people.
Exactly.
Yep.
Samantha has kids. We'll recruit them.
Yes. Samantha, we're coming for your children. Yes. We keep going.
So anyway, space opera. Interestingly, you can probably trace the roots of space opera back quite a ways, but it starts to really take its true form with Edgar Rice Burroughs. But now, when you're talking about the Martian Tales, which Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote between 1914 and like 1940 something, starting with A Princess of Mars, those stories, you don't have spaceships. You've got John Carter magically transported from Civil War Earth over to Mars, and he's stranded there. And
Still a great story.
They have flying machines and stuff like that on Mars, but they don't go to other planets. They don't go into space. It becomes really just a fantasy.
It's a homeworld technology.
Yeah. The story really becomes a fantasy, kind of like a Conan type hero. He-Man, go out and defeat all comers kind of story.
The Lone Star Ranger.
Yeah.
So to speak.
So it fits that basic mold of space opera, but it doesn't take place in space. It's on another planet. But it's a planet that today we know is total fantasy. You could easily set it in Siberia or wherever else.
Yeah.
I don't feel it quite meets the criteria of space opera, which requires some kind of space travel.
Interesting. I mean, there's like a wormhole travel kind of thing going on.
Yeah, but it's not scientifically explained. It's just like a magical device to throw the guy into this fantasy world and have adventures.
Wait, so does that mean Out of the Silent Planet is a space opera?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah! Too bad the last book sucked. Which was not at all a space opera. It ended there. There was nothing space opera-esque about it. The other two were in the trilogy.
I think Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandra kind of go beyond typical space opera, though. They're a little deeper, a little more involved than what you'll get in most space opera. So what I feel qualifies as the first space opera is The Skylark of Space by Edward Elmer Smith. And I'm not the only one that said that.
Mm-hmm.
I may be wrong. Maybe there's some other book out there I'm not aware of.
Mm-hmm.
But Edward Elmer Smith, better known as Doc Smith, he wrote the Skylark of Space and published it in Amazing Stories in 1928, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, in the same issue as Armageddon 2419 AD by Philip Francis Nolan, which is the first Buck Rogers story.
Oh, interesting.
But Smith is considered to be first because he wrote his stories way back during World War One. He just never found a publisher until Amazing Stories in the late 1920s, where Philip Francis Nolan wrote his story in late 1920s. And what's even more interesting about Edward Elmer Smith is he was born in Sheboygan.
Yep, Sheboygan, Wisconsin.
So, space opera capital of the world.
Woo! I feel like a lot of science fiction writers and just like fantasy and fiction writers did originate in Wisconsin. There's a lot of cool stuff as part of the fantasy world that originated from Wisconsinites.
Oh, yeah. Stanley Weinbaum. Robert Bloch, Psycho. Yep. He's from Wisconsin. August Derleth.
Yeah.
Clifford Simak,
yeah,
who wrote City. He's Wisconsin. There's a lot of them. There's a huge number of them.
We give you serial killers and science fiction writers and fantasy writers.
That shows you what's happened to our brains by being on all this beer and cheese.
Beer and cheese makes you more creative. Who needs drugs when you can have beer and cheese?
Yep.
Delightful.
So, the late 1920s, early 1930s were mostly space opera in the science fiction magazines. When Astounding came out in 1930, they talked about what they called the thought variant story, which became the John W. Campbell Golden Age type of stories. But when they first started doing it, their stories were heavy on adventure, not so heavy on thought variant.
Gotcha.
So there were a lot of, and Campbell himself was writing these stories of these guys going out, blowing up alien planets, and,
very shoot 'em up-esque.
Yeah, very adventure-oriented, not so good on science.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of that, a lot of somebody I'm going to be talking about specifically, R.F. Starzl. He started writing in 1930 and published in most of the amazing, thrilling, amazing stories, wonder stories, astounding stories. And he wrote about what he called the Interplanetary Flying Police.
Oh.
Interesting name, because if you're interplanetary, aren't you already flying? So isn't that kind of
a little oxymoron?
Given?
Well, maybe it's flying instead of teleporting.
Well, yeah.
You never know.
But they don't really fly because they're spaceships. Spaceships don't fly really until they enter an atmosphere.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, he wrote most of his stories are about the Interplanetary Flying Police, which are these people that go around solving crimes all around the solar system.
Basically, the
Very
Galactic
space
Empire.
opera. Yeah.
But CSI version instead of just
not Galactic
Nazi
Empire.
version.
It's strictly solar system.
Oh, interesting.
And a lot of the early science fiction was confined to the solar system. And when E.E. Smith, he finished up his Skylark series and he started writing the Lensman series in the early 1930s. And the Lensman now went out to the stars and became intergalactic.
Ooh, interesting.
And so the Lensman series, there's 6 books in it, is very famous because it was a game changer. It took science fiction beyond the solar system like it hadn't done before.
And now we have Star Trek.
Yeah.
Because of that.
Kind of. I mean, from Smith and Campbell writing space opera, Edmund Hamilton was another one. He was known as World Wrecker Hamilton because he wrote a number of stories where he blew up planets.
I mean, sometimes you just gotta exterminate.
Exactly.
Exterminate.
So, and that's kind of where the Death Star in Star Wars comes from, is a lot of what he wrote back then. And so then in the 1940s, you have Astounding creating this change in science fiction where it became a little bit better written and became more about science and technology. But that was really confined to Astounding Stories. The other magazines, Amazing, and the new magazines that came along, Planet Stories and Startling Stories, they still were heavy on adventure. And so then you have some new authors like Leigh Brackett writing these space operas through the 1940s. And then in the 1950s along comes authors like Poul Anderson. He wrote a lot of astounding type stories, but he also wrote a lot of Planet Stories, adventures, and including the first of the Flandre stories was published in Planet Stories by Poul Anderson. So a lot of authors carried the torch, and they kind of made space opera more sophisticated as you go through the years. Once you get to the 1950s, the stories are much better written than what you had in the 1930s. But you still had that basic adventure kind of light on specific science.
Yeah.
You know, certain things were givens. You travel through hyperspace to get to other stars. You have energy weapons to blow things up. You have alien races that you have to fight.
All those things that influenced a lot of what we know now in science fiction. Tropes that just stuck.
Yeah.
And technology that just stuck.
And of course, this was fostered by the success of Buck Rogers, which was then followed up by Flash Gordon in the Funny Papers.
Gordon.
Yeah. And those became made into serials back in the 1930s, 1940s. And, of course, eventually ended up on TV and movies, and just went a long way. Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon became icons in our society that even a lot of people who didn't ever get into science fiction still liked Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon in the Sunday paper.
Yeah.
So that was a big deal. And of course that influenced people like George Lucas when he decided to make Star Wars. He was looking back at a lot of things. The Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, he was looking back at war movies, he was looking back at pirate movies, he was all the different
Samurai
genres of
culture.
adventure, and kind of distilled it all together.
Yep.
And brought it back. And that's why it was such a big hit, is because there were still so many people in 1977 who grew up with those movies and thought, yes, Errol
Here's
Flynn.
somebody who made it like something serious.
Well, they brought back their youth, and also brought it back in a new way that the youth of the time was also inspired by, and it kind of brought a lot of people together.
And amazing graphics for their time.
Yeah.
Which then got updated even after that, once Pixar was purchased. Or before Pixar was purchased.
Yeah, well, Industrial Light and Magic was founded to do special effects for Star Wars.
And then it was purchased by Disney.
Lucas poured a lot of money into them just experimenting with technology, and they developed a lot of stuff that
which in and of itself was its own space opera by definition.
So, space opera has come a long way, but it is different from science fiction. It can be science fiction, but it isn't necessarily, strictly speaking, science fiction. It can be just Wagon Train in Space.
Whee!
Or a pirate story, but with spaceships.
Like Treasure Planet.
Yeah.
Which is basically Treasure Island, but with a planet instead.
Yeah.
Or Titan AE. I'm just naming movies now.
There you go.
Because those are what my brain remember. Because this is me just getting into more of this classic science fiction and classic space opera stuff through Telltale. This is my first experience with a lot of this. But my previous experiences are all on movies that I'm finally relating to other stories and seeing where the history of these storylines came from, which is really fun. I like it.
And as far as reading, I'm not making this distinction simply to say, well, all this stuff is not science fiction. It's not about snobbery at all.
Yeah.
It's just pointing out the differences between the types of, we can call it all science fiction. But there is a difference between standard space opera and your standard Campbellian thought variant type of story. There is a big difference between what those stories are trying to do.
Yes.
although there can be mixtures.
Yes. To everything, there's basically a giant Venn diagram of all things, especially in book genres and stuff. There's plenty of overlap in so many different ways.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, we're even reading, like, Gideon the Ninth is basically a space opera. When you think about it too, but it is
But
so
that one goes
focused
even
on
further
the
because
fantasy.
it's fantasy, it's space opera, it's comedy.
There is a little bit of
it's,
science
you
fiction,
know,
dark comedy.
There's
Yeah.
just there's just there's skeletons that come back alive, which
Yeah.
is kind of horror, but
Yeah.
I mean there's just and there's mystery
Yep.
in Gideon the Ninth is basically a hunt.
Yeah. It's basically a
Old dark
whodunit.
house mystery kind
Yeah.
of story.
Yes. Yes. It has a
It's
lot of
so
overlap.
many things crossing so many genres, which I think is what really makes that particular book so great. So anyway, basically just wanted to talk about this to point out that there are differences, but hey, it's all good. Go out and
Yes.
enjoy it all.
Yes. We're not going to poke fun at anything.
Nope.
Because it's all delightful.
And that's all I got to say.
That's all I gotta say too.
So subscribe, like us, leave comments, come back and see more videos. We're going to have a lot more like this coming up.
Yep. And tell us some of your favorite space operas, either by your definition or ours. We'll have debates. We'll fight you. Thanks.